The most dangerous place in American music wasn't the highway or the drug-fueled parties. It was the air inside the tour bus. For Roy Nichols, the genius guitarist behind Merle Haggard, the atmosphere that birthed his legendary sound was also the weapon that slowly killed him. He spent 40 years inhaling the blue smoke of honky-tonks, trading his lung capacity for a legacy that the world would eventually forget. While he was busy helping to shape the Bakersfield Sound that would define a generation of outlaws, his own body was turning against him, leading to a stroke that paralyzed the most gifted hands in country music. This is not just a story about a musician. It is a crime scene investigation of a career that suffocated its creator. How did the man who gave a voice to the American working class end up gasping for air in total obscurity? Roy Nichols was not merely born into a family. He was born into a sociological phenomenon. His entry into the world in 1932, in the parched landscape of Chandler, Arizona, coincided with the greatest internal migration in American history. He was a child of the Dust Bowl, a biological product of the catastrophe that John Steinbeck chronicled with ink, but which the Nichols family wrote with their blood and calloused hands. To understand the peculiar biting precision of Roy's guitar playing decades later, one must understand that he did not grow up with the luxury of excess. In the world of the Okie migration, a derogatory term that painted all migrants from the Southwest with the same brush of poverty and ignorance, nothing was wasted. You didn't waste water, you didn't waste food, and you certainly didn't waste notes. This philosophy of scarcity, ingrained in him before he could speak, would later define his musical signature, a refusal to play a single superfluous sound. The California that the Nichols family found when they moved west was not the land of milk and honey promised in the brochures. It was the other California, a vast industrial agricultural basin that felt more like the Deep South than the Pacific Coast. It was a place of blistering heat and back-breaking labor, where the social hierarchy was brutally clear. The growers owned the land, and the migrants were merely the fuel that kept the harvest running. In this environment, music was not a hobby or an art form. It was a utility. It was a psychological shield. When the sun went down and the work in the fields stopped, the music started, not in concert halls, but on the porches of shacks and around fire pits in the labor camps. It was the only thing the bank couldn't foreclose on. Young Roy was an observer in this world, a quiet boy with eyes that seemed to take in everything and a demeanor that was unnervingly calm for a child. While other children ran wild in the irrigation ditches, Roy was drawn to the radio. But he wasn't listening like a fan. He was listening like a mechanic trying to understand how an engine worked. He heard the swing jazz of the big bands, the fervent gospel of the tent revivals, and the hillbilly music that reminded his parents of home. In his mind, these disparate sounds began to merge. He didn't see boundaries between genres. He only saw the fretboard. By the time he was a teenager, the family had settled near Fresno, in the heart of the valley. It was here that the prodigy began to reveal himself. It wasn't just that he could play, it was that he possessed a terrifying innate understanding of harmony and timing that usually takes a lifetime to master. He didn't have formal lessons. There were no conservatories in the labor camps. His teachers were the rough-handed men who played for drinks in the local dives and the crackling 78 RPM records that he slowed down with his thumb to steal the licks. At 14 years old, an age when most boys are navigating the awkwardness of puberty, Roy Nichols was already a working professional, navigating a much more dangerous world. He was sneaking into the blood buckets, the violent, smoke-choked honky-tonks that lined the highways of the valley. These were not places for the faint of heart. They were cavernous, windowless halls where oil workers, truckers, and field hands went to drink away the pain of their existence. The atmosphere was volatile. Fights were common. The flash of a knife was not a rare sight. In this arena, a musician could not be timid. If you played quiet, acoustic folk music, the crowd would eat you alive. You had to be loud. You had to be electric. You had to cut through the noise of breaking glass and shouting men. It was in these trenches that Roy forged his style. He learned to play the Fender Telecaster, a slab of solid wood that was virtually indestructible because it was the only instrument that could survive the environment. He developed a right-hand technique that was percussive and sharp, snapping the strings against the fretboard to create a sound that was less like a strum and more like a gunshot. He wasn't playing for applause, he was playing for survival. He learned to read the room, to shift the tempo when a fight was brewing, to soothe the beast or wake it up. He was a boy among hard men, earning his respect not with his fists, but with the undeniable authority of his hands. His reputation spread through the valley like a rumor of rain in a drought. Musicians began to whisper about the kid in Fresno who played like a man possessed. It wasn't long before he caught the ear of the most chaotic, colorful, and commercially successful act on the West Coast, the Maddox Brothers and Rose. To join the Maddox Brothers was to join a traveling circus. They were the antithesis of the stoic, serious Roy Nichols. They were flashy, loud, and garish, known as the most colorful hillbilly band in America. They drove Cadillacs, wore custom-made satin uniforms embroidered with peacocks and cacti, and played a turbocharged blend of country and boogie-woogie that predated rock and roll by a decade. Fred Maddox, the bass player, didn't pluck the strings. He slapped them, creating a rhythmic drive that hit the audience in the chest. Rose Maddox, the lead singer, was a firecracker of a woman with a voice that could peel paint. When Roy Nichols stepped onto the stage with them, the visual contrast was almost comical. Here was this quiet, unassuming teenager, often standing in the shadows, surrounded by a whirlwind of satin and screaming. But the moment he took a solo, the dynamic shifted. The Maddox brothers provided the energy, but Roy provided the sophistication. He brought a level of jazz complexity to their hillbilly boogie that elevated the music from novelty to art. He wove intricate chromatic lines around Rose's vocals, creating a counterpoint that was years ahead of its time. Life with the Maddox brothers was a grueling education in the reality of the road. This was the era before tour buses with sleeping bunks and air conditioning. They traveled in sedans, crammed together with their instruments, driving hundreds of miles through the night to make the next gig. They played dance halls, rodeos, and fairs, covering the vast expanse of the American West. Roy learned to sleep sitting up. He learned to eat at roadside diners where the coffee tasted like battery acid. He learned how to shave in gas station bathrooms. It was a nomadic, exhausting existence that severed him from a normal adolescence. He had no prom, no high school football games, no steady girlfriend. His youth was consumed by the white lines of the highway and the relentless rhythm of the tires on the pavement. But it was during these years that Roy began to suffer the invisible damage that would later claim his life. The venues they played were not just loud, they were toxic. Ventilation was non-existent. Every breath he took on stage was a mixture of oxygen and the thick blue smoke of 1,000 cigarettes. The band members smoked, the audience smoked. The air was a carcinogenic soup. For a teenager with developing lungs, it was a slow-motion poisoning. He didn't know it then, nobody did, but every solo he played was being taxed against his future breath. Despite the success with the Maddox brothers, there was a sense that Roy was still searching. The music was fun, it was popular, but it was often a spectacle. The Maddox brothers were entertainers first and musicians second. Roy, in his heart, was a purist. He treated the guitar with a reverence that bordered on the spiritual. He wasn't interested in jumping around or telling jokes. He wanted to explore the sonic possibilities of the instrument. He was hearing sounds in his head, mournful, bending, weeping sounds that didn't fit the raucous boogie of the Maddox clan. By the late 1950s, the golden era of the Maddox brothers was winding down, and the musical landscape was shifting. Rock and roll had arrived, sweeping away the old hillbilly bands. Roy found himself a veteran at the age of 25, a hired gun with a peerless reputation but no permanent home. He drifted between gigs, playing with Lefty Frizzell and Win Stewart, refining his craft, waiting for a collaborator who could match his intensity. He was a master without a muse, a sword without a war. He spent these interim years in the dim light of the Bakersfield clubs, places like the Blackboard and the Lucky Spot. These were the incubators of the new sound. The music was getting harder, driving, more aggressive. The Bakersfield Sound was coalescing, defining itself in opposition to the smooth, string-laden pop coming out of Nashville. Nashville was polished. Bakersfield was raw. Nashville was a tuxedo. Bakersfield was a denim shirt with oil stains. Roy Nichols was the prince of this kingdom, the man everyone wanted on their bandstand, but he remained an enigma. He would show up, plug in, play a solo that would leave the other musicians with their jaws on the floor, and then pack up his guitar and vanish into the night. He was waiting. He didn't know who he was waiting for, but he knew that the voice he was meant to accompany hadn't appeared yet. He needed a singer who understood the darkness as well as he did, someone who had walked through the fire and come out the other side with a story to tell. He needed a partner who could turn the pain of the Dust Bowl, the prison of poverty, and the loneliness of the highway into poetry. And then, in a serendipitous collision of fate, a young man with a prison haircut and a hunger in his eyes walked into a club where Roy was playing. The young man's name was Merle Haggard, and he was fresh out of San Quentin, carrying nothing but a checkered past and a voice that sounded like it had been soaked in whiskey and tears. The moment was approaching. The architect was about to meet the builder, but before history could be written, before the hits could be recorded, Roy Nichols had to make a choice. He had to decide if he was willing to bet his future on an ex-con with no hit records, or if he would stay in the safety of the shadows. The stage was set, the amplifiers were humming, and the silence was about to be broken forever. When that silence finally broke, it wasn't with a cymbal crash at all. It began with something much smaller and stranger, a quiet handshake in a smoky bar. The collision between Roy Nichols and Merle Haggard did not happen with the fanfare of a cymbal crash. It happened with the quiet, inevitable click of a lock tumbling into place. It was 1965, and the geography of country music was split by a deep ideological canyon. On one side was Nashville, a city that was rapidly trading its denim for sequins, smoothing out the rough edges of the music with lush string sections and backing choirs, desperate to cross over into the polite living rooms of pop America. On the other side was Bakersfield, a dusty, sun-bleached outpost that didn't give a damn about polite society. And sitting at the bar of a joint called High Pockets, nursing a drink and a grudge against the world, was Merle Haggard. Haggard was a walking scar of a man. He had recently been released from San Quentin State Prison, a place that had stripped him of his youth and replaced it with a permanent, haunted wariness. He was trying to sing, trying to write, but he was missing the engine that could drive his vision. He had a band, but they were loose, undisciplined, lacking the razor-sharp precision he heard in his head. He knew of Roy Nichols. Everyone in the valley knew of Roy Nichols. Roy was the pro, the guy who had played the Grand Ole Opry with the Maddox brothers when Merle was still stealing cars. To Merle, Roy was royalty. To Roy, Merle was just another ex-con with a guitar case and a dream, a dime a dozen in the honky-tonks of California. The story of their union has been told so many times, it has acquired the patina of folklore, but the truth is grittier than the legend. Merle didn't just ask Roy to join the band. He practically confessed to him. He approached the stoic guitarist and laid his cards on the beer-stained table. He admitted he was an ex-convict. He admitted he had no money. He admitted that the odds of success were laughable. Then he delivered the line that would become the epitaph of their partnership. Merle all but confessed that he couldn't pay Roy what he was worth, but begged him to take the gamble anyway, promising that if they stuck together, they just might make history. Roy Nichols, a man who had heard every hustle and every empty promise in the music business, looked at the young singer. He saw desperation, but he also saw steel. He took a drag of his cigarette, narrowed his eyes, and decided to take the gamble. He wasn't joining a band. He was enlisting in a war against silence. The group was christened The Strangers, a name that perfectly encapsulated their outsider status. But a band name is just words. The sound is the truth. And the sound that Roy Nichols and Merle Haggard began to construct in the cramped studios of Capitol Records was unlike anything America had heard before. It was a sonic assault. They took the swing of Bob Wills, the heartache of Lefty Frizzle, and the electric aggression of the blues, and they welded them together with volume. At the center of this new architecture was Roy's instrument, the Fender Telecaster. In the hierarchy of guitars, the Telecaster is the working man's shovel. It is a simple, flat plank of wood with two pickups and a bolt-on neck. It has no hiding places. It is unforgiving. If you make a mistake on a Telecaster, it screams it to the back of the room. But in the hands of a master, it is capable of a terrifying range of emotion. Roy Nichols didn't just play the Telecaster, he weaponized it. He developed a style that musicians would later call chicken pickin', though the term feels too comical for the seriousness of the technique. It involved using a stiff pick and the fleshy part of his fingers to snap the strings against the fretboard, creating a staccato, percussive cluck that cut through the mix like a knife. It was a sound born of necessity. In the noisy bars of Bakersfield, a soft note was a dead note. You had to punch your way through the wall of noise. But Roy's genius wasn't just in the attack, it was in the sustain. He became obsessed with mimicking the sound of the pedal steel guitar, that crying, whining instrument that is the hallmark of country music. But Roy didn't want to play a pedal steel, he wanted to be one. He discovered that by swelling the volume knob with his pinky finger while simultaneously bending a string behind the nut of the guitar neck, he could eliminate the sharp pluck of the note, leaving only a ghostly, rising swell that sounded like a human voice, moaning in pain. It was a technique of impossible dexterity, requiring his hands to do 3 different things at once, but the result was magic. It gave the Strangers a sound that was both tough and tender, metallic yet weeping. As the hits began to roll in, Swing Indoors, The Bottle Let Me Down, I'm a Lonesome Fugitive, a pattern emerged. Merle would sing the verse, laying out the narrative of the drunk, the prisoner, the heartbroken loser. Then he would step back, and Roy would step forward. Roy's solos were not opportunities to show off. They were continuations of the story. If Merle sang about a closing door, Roy's guitar sounded like the hinges rusting. If Merle sang about a bottle, Roy's guitar sounded like the glass shattering. They were engaging in a conversation that excluded the rest of the world. It was a call and response between 2 men who understood that sadness was not a mood, but a location. The chemistry was palpable, even to the casual listener. Merle Haggard had a voice that was rich, deep, and authoritative, but it was also weary. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much. Roy's guitar provided the spark, the nervous energy that kept the sadness from becoming lethargic. He played on the balls of his feet, musically speaking. He pushed the beat, driving the band forward, ensuring that even the saddest ballads had a pulse that made you want to tap your foot or order another round. By the late 1960s, the Strangers were widely considered the best band in country music and arguably one of the best bands in the world, regardless of genre. They were a machine. They didn't use set lists. They didn't rehearse in the traditional sense. They played so many shows, 200, 250 nights a year, that they communicated via telepathy. Merle would just start a song, sometimes a song he had written in the van that afternoon, and Roy would fall in immediately, finding the key, the tempo, and the groove within seconds. This era, the golden age of the Bakersfield Sound, was a blur of motion. The bus became their universe. It was a silver capsule hurtling through the American night, a mobile monastery devoted to the worship of the song. Inside that bus, a hierarchy existed. Merle was the captain, the erratic genius who might decide to drive 300 miles out of the way to see a fishing spot. But Roy was the first mate, the stabilizer. He was the one the other musicians looked to when Merle was in a mood. Roy sat in his seat, usually with a Western paperback in his hand and a cigarette in his mouth, an anchor in a sea of chaos. But the U.S. against them mentality was real. They felt the scorn of the Nashville establishment. To the producers on Music Row, the Strangers were rough, unrefined, and dangerous. They didn't use charts. They didn't use the A-team session players who played on everyone else's records. Merle insisted that his road band play on his studio albums, a revolutionary demand at the time. He wanted the grit. He wanted the mistakes. He wanted Roy Nichols. There is a specific recording from this era that captures the essence of Roy's contribution. The live album Okie from Muskogee, recorded in 1969. The title track became a cultural lightning rod, a conservative anthem in the middle of the Vietnam War protests. But if you strip away the politics and listen to the music, you hear a band at the peak of its powers. When Roy takes his solo on Mama Tried, it is a masterclass in economy. He doesn't play a million notes. He plays exactly the right notes with a tone that is biting, clear, and defiant. It is the sound of the American working class standing its ground. It is the sound of a man who knows exactly who he is and doesn't need to shout to prove it. However, beneath the surface of this musical triumph, the seeds of tragedy were being watered daily. The environment that created the Strangers was killing them. The bus was a tube of smoke. The dressing rooms were boxes of smoke. The honky-tonks were cathedrals of smoke. Roy Nichols, like almost every musician of his generation, was a heavy smoker. It was part of the uniform. You had your guitar, your amp, your cowboy hat, and your pack of cigarettes. It was a coping mechanism for the boredom of the road, a way to punctuate the endless hours of waiting. Roy was a quiet man, and his vices were quiet. He wasn't a pill popper like some. He wasn't a chaotic drunk like others. He was a steady, rhythmic smoker. He inhaled the toxic air of the bars and the bus with the same stoicism he applied to everything else. He didn't know that inside his chest, the delicate tissue of his lungs was slowly turning to leather. He didn't know that the breath he used to phrase those beautiful crying notes was a finite resource that he was burning through at an accelerated rate. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the fame of Merle Haggard skyrocketed. He became a superstar, gracing the cover of Time magazine. He was hailed as the poet of the common man. But fame has a way of distorting reality. The spotlight focused intensely on the singer, leaving the band in the penumbra. Roy Nichols was becoming a legend to the guitar players, to the likes of Keith Richards and the Grateful Dead who worshiped the Strangers. But to the general public, he was just the guy in the hat, standing to the left of the star. This invisibility didn't seem to bother Roy. In fact, he seemed to cultivate it. He had no desire to be the front man. He had seen the toll it took on Merle, the pressure, the expectations, the lack of privacy. Roy preferred the anonymity of the sideman. He could walk into a diner and eat a burger without being hassled, while Merle had to hide in the bus. Roy was free in a way that Merle was not. But this freedom came at a cost. His legacy was being written in disappearing ink. He was essential yet replaceable in the eyes of the industry. He was the sound but not the face. And so the Silver Eagle bus rolled on, clocking miles that would eventually circle the globe multiple times. Roy Nichols sat in his seat, watching the American landscape blur past the window. The cornfields of Nebraska, the oil rigs of Texas, the pine forests of Georgia. He was writing the soundtrack for a country that was changing faster than he could strum. He was the constant variable in an equation that was about to get much more complex. The music was getting louder, the crowds were getting bigger, and the smoke in the air was getting thicker. The peak had been reached, but on the other side of the mountain, the descent was waiting, and it would be steeper and darker than anyone in the Strangers could have imagined. Yet before the darkness could fully consume them, there was a final blinding flash of brilliance that looked deceptively like immortality. The momentum they had built did not dissipate immediately. Instead, it propelled them into the strangest corridors of power, far removed from the neon signs of the honky-tonks. By the time the 1970s arrived, the machinery of the Strangers was no longer running on mere gasoline and ambition. It was running on a kind of imperial momentum. The band had transcended the grimy circuit of Bakersfield beer halls to stand at the very center of American culture. In 1973, they found themselves not in a dive bar, but in the East Room of the White House, performing for President Richard Nixon. It was a surreal tableau. Pat Nixon in her stiff formal wear, the president with his frozen smile, and there standing to the left of Merle Haggard was Roy Nichols. He wore a tuxedo, but he looked like a coyote trapped in a parlor. He wore his trademark sunglasses indoors, a subtle rebellion against the pomp and circumstance, and when he took his solo, he didn't soften his attack for the dignitaries. He played with the same biting, trebly aggression that he used to cut through the noise of a Saturday night brawl in Fresno. It was a statement. The music of the working class had breached the gates of power, and Roy Nichols was its silent ambassador. This era marked the zenith of Roy's technical mastery. He had ceased to be just a guitar player and had become a stylist of such distinctiveness that he was practically a genre unto himself. While the rest of the rock and country world was obsessed with volume, distortion, and the phallic worship of the guitar god solo, Roy was moving in the opposite direction. He was becoming quieter, more surgical. He began to treat silence as a note. He realized that what you didn't play was just as important as what you did. In the midst of a raucous track like I Think I'll Just Stay Here and Drink, Roy would wait. He would let the measure breathe, let the tension build, and then with the precision of a sniper, he would insert a lick, a chromatic run, a bending double stop that turned the song on its head. It was during these years that the telepathy of the band became legendary. They were playing nearly 200 shows a year. They spent more time with each other than they did with their wives or children. On stage, they moved like a flock of birds turning instantly without a visible signal. Merle Haggard was a notorious improviser. He would change the set list mid-song, change the key, or suddenly decide to give Roy an extended solo because he felt like taking a drag of his cigarette. Roy never flinched. He watched Merle's shoulders. He watched the heel of Merle's boot. He knew what Merle was going to do before Merle knew it. This wasn't just rehearsal. It was a shared consciousness born of thousands of hours of shared air. But the air they shared was becoming the primary antagonist of the story. To understand the tragedy that was slowly unfolding inside Roy Nichols' chest, one must understand the atmosphere of the 1970s. It was a decade defined by smoke. Today we view smoking as a personal habit, segregated to designated outdoor areas. In the 1970s, it was the texture of reality. It was everywhere. It was on the airplanes, in the restaurants, in the hospital waiting rooms, and most densely in the venues where the strangers worked. The tour bus, the Silver Eagle, was essentially a rolling humidor. Merle smoked, Roy smoked, the crew smoked. The windows were sealed shut to keep the air conditioning in, trapping the blue haze inside. They would drive for 12 hours from Tulsa to Omaha, existing in a cloud of particulate matter. Then they would arrive at the venue, a coliseum or a honky-tonk, where the air was even worse. The stage lights would cut through the fog of thousands of audience members lighting up. Roy Nichols lived in this environment for virtually every waking moment of his adult life. He was a man of routine. He would wake up, pour a cup of black coffee, and light a cigarette. He would play a game of poker, his other great passion, with a cigarette dangling from his lip. He would stand on stage, the neck of his Telecaster bathed in nicotine-stained light, inhaling the exhaust of the crowd. He was a filter. For 40 years, his lungs filtered the air of the American nightlife. He was not a man to complain. The ethos of the Depression-era child still governed his life. You do the work, you take the check, and you keep your mouth shut. If he had a cough, it was just a smoker's cough, a badge of the trade. If he was short of breath, it was just the altitude of Denver or the humidity of Houston. He ignored the biological warning signs with the same stoicism he applied to a broken guitar string. You work around it. You keep playing. Yet, even as the smoke swirled, the music he produced was crystalline. The 1970s saw Roy experimenting with jazz inflections that baffled the country purists. He was a devotee of Django Reinhardt and Charlie Christian, and he began to sneak those sophisticated swinging chords into Merle's hard-driving country songs. It was a subversive act. He was teaching the audience about jazz harmony without them realizing it. On a song like Rainbow Stew, Roy's playing is bouncy and light, dancing around the melody with a wit that belies the cynicism of the lyrics. His influence during this period began to bleed out into the wider world, even if his name did not. In England, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones was listening. In San Francisco, Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead was listening. They marveled at the economy of his playing. They couldn't understand how he got so much emotion out of a guitar that was famously difficult to play. The Fender Telecaster fights you. It has high action and a thick neck. To bend a string on a Telecaster requires physical strength. Roy made it look like he was stroking a cat. He had hands of iron wrapped in velvet. But the lifestyle of the Sideman is a strange purgatory. You are famous, but you are not. You are wealthy compared to a factory worker, but a pauper compared to the star. Roy Nichols was the star of the sidebar. In the credits of the albums, his name was listed, but on the street he was invisible. This anonymity suited him, but it also isolated him. He didn't have the entourage that Merle had. He didn't have the yes men. He had his poker buddies in the band and his guitar. As the decade wore on, the outlaw country movement, which Merle and Roy had arguably invented, began to morph into something else. The slickness of the urban cowboy era was approaching. Synthesizers were creeping into country music. Drums were getting gated and reverbed. The dry, honest sound of the Bakersfield Telecaster was starting to sound vintage, a polite word for old. Merle, ever the restless artist, began to experiment with different sounds, adding horns, adding saxophones. The sonic space that Roy had dominated for so long was getting crowded. There were moments of friction. Roy was a purist. He didn't like the clutter. He believed that if you couldn't say it with a guitar, a fiddle, and a steel, it wasn't worth saying. But he remained loyal. He was the first mate. He wouldn't abandon the ship just because the captain wanted to paint it a different color. However, the physical toll was becoming impossible to ignore. By the late 70s, friends began to notice that Roy was thinner. His face, always lean, was becoming gaunt. The deep lines around his mouth, etched by years of squinting through smoke, were becoming canyons. He was tiring more easily. The walk from the dressing room to the bus, once a quick jaunt, became a deliberate march. He was winding down, even as the tour schedule ramped up. There is a specific tragedy in the aging of a virtuoso. The mind remains sharp. The musical ideas are still there, flowing like a river. Roy could still hear the solos in his head, complex, lightning-fast runs that would dazzle the crowd. But the connection between the brain and the hands was relying on a body that was being slowly suffocated. Oxygen is the fuel of the muscles. As his lung capacity diminished, the microscopic fibers in his fingers were being starved. He had to work harder to achieve the same results. The effortlessness that defined his style was becoming an act of sheer will. He was entering the twilight of his career, though he refused to acknowledge the setting sun. He was a creature of the road, and he knew no other life. To stop would be to admit defeat. To stop would be to become just another old man in Bakersfield sitting on a porch. So he kept climbing onto the bus. He kept lighting the cigarettes. He kept plugging in the Telecaster. He was driving toward a cliff edge that was hidden in the fog, driven by a devotion to the music that was both his salvation and his executioner. The 1980s were looming, a decade of neon, excess, and digital noise that would have little patience for a man who played the guitar with the dusty soul of the 1930s. The world was changing, turning its back on the analog honesty of the Strangers. Roy Nichols stood on the precipice of this new era, his silhouette framed against the stage lights, a solitary figure guarding a flame that was flickering in the wind. The silence he had masterfully used in his music was about to turn against him, manifesting not as a pause between notes, but as a breathless void in his own chest. That internal void was soon mirrored by the cultural vacuum forming around them. As Roy fought for air, the very atmosphere of the country was shifting, replacing the organic grit of the past with a synthetic gloss that had no room for a wheezing lung or a rusted string. The 1980s arrived in Nashville like a neon meteor, crashing into the rustic landscape of country music and obliterating the old order. The genre was shedding its skin, trading the dusty denim of the outlaw era for the rhinestone-studded jackets of the urban cowboy movement. The sound was changing too. The dry, honest thump of the bass drum was replaced by the gated reverb of digital percussion. The weeping steel guitar was pushed aside for the glossy hum of synthesizers. In this brave new world of perfectly coiffed hair and radio-friendly pop crossovers, Roy Nichols was a ghost before he was even dead. He stood on the stage in the midst of this digital revolution, a spectral figure in a cowboy hat, clutching his Telecaster like a relic from a lost civilization. The music industry was obsessed with perfect, but Roy Nichols had spent his life perfecting human. The new producers wanted tracks that were clicked to a grid, sanitized, and safe. Roy played with a swing, a drag, a push, the imperceptible micro-timings of a human heart beating in a chest. He was an analog master in a binary world, and though the crowds still cheered for Merle, there was a sense that the ground beneath the strangers was shrinking. But the external threat of changing trends was nothing compared to the internal siege taking place within Roy's own body. The invisible bill for 50 years of breathing secondhand smoke was finally coming due, and the interest rate was catastrophic. It started subtly. A shortness of breath after carrying his amplifier, a cough that lingered a little too long in the mornings, a fatigue that couldn't be slept off. Roy Nichols, the man who had always been the first one ready, began to move slower. The walk from the bus to the stage, once a routine trudge, became a tactical operation. He had to measure his steps, conserve his oxygen, calculating the distance like a diver watching his air gauge. Doctors eventually told him what years of smoke had done. He was living with serious lung disease, a cruel and ironic burden for a musician whose life depended on breath. It didn't just steal his air, it slowly stole his rhythm. Music is a physical act. It requires oxygen to fuel the muscles in the fingers, the brain's processing speed. Roy's world shrank to the size of his living room. The accolades started to trickle in, too late to matter financially, but perhaps comforting spiritually. The Academy of Country Music, the organizations that had ignored him for years, finally began to acknowledge his contribution. But awards are heavy things to hold when your hands are paralyzed. He spent his final years surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. The recordings were his proof of life. When he listened to Okie from Muskogee or The Fight Inside of Me, he wasn't just hearing music. He was hearing the sound of his own healthy lungs, his own nimble fingers, his own relevance. He was listening to a version of himself that was immortal, preserved in the amber of vinyl, even as the flesh and blood version withered. The tragedy of Roy Nichols in the late 1990s was not that he died, but that he had to watch his own erasure in real time. He saw the industry pivot to pop country. He saw the Bakersfield Sound become a museum exhibit rather than a living force, and he saw himself fading from the conversation, a footnote in the biography of a superstar. But the fires never truly went out. Inside the failing shell, the mind of the musician was still working. He was still hearing melodies. He was still correcting the timing of the songs on the radio. He was playing the greatest solos of his life in the cathedral of his mind, where the air was clean. The fingers were fast and the bus was always waiting to take him to the next town. He was simply waiting for the final curtain to drop, for the house lights to go black, and for the long, hard tour to finally, mercifully, end. The silence of the house in Bakersfield was a stark contrast to the roar of the coliseums Roy Nichols had once commanded. The guitar was silent, the hands were still, and the breath was shallow. But as the 21st century dawned, the final chapter of Roy's life would not be defined by what he lost, but by what remained. The man who had spent his life in the shadows was about to slip into the ultimate darkness, leaving behind a question that hangs in the air of every honky-tonk to this day. What happens to the sound when the instrument is broken? The year 2001 arrived not with the flying cars and chrome cities that the science fiction of Roy Nichols' youth had promised, but with a digital whimper. The world was rapidly dematerializing. Music was turning into data, stored on hard drives and iPods, stripped of its physical packaging and its liner notes. The tactile experience of holding a record, of reading the names of the musicians who played on the tracks, was becoming obsolete. In this new, frictionless century, a man like Roy Nichols, a man made of grit, nicotine, and analog wire, seemed like a relic from an archaeological dig. In his small home in Bakersfield, Roy's world had narrowed to the radius of his oxygen tubing. The man who had crossed the continent more times than he could count, who had seen the sunrise over the Brooklyn Bridge and the sunset over the Golden Gate, was now confined to a single room. His breath, once the engine of his phrasing, was now a labored mechanical struggle. The emphysema had claimed the last of his reserves. He was fighting for air in the very valley where the dust had once choked the sky during his childhood. The circle was closing, and it was closing with a cruel symmetry. On July 3rd, 2001, the struggle ended. Roy Nichols passed away at Mercy Hospital in Bakersfield. He was 68 years old. The news of his death did not stop the presses. There were no primetime interruptions on CNN. The world did not pause to mourn as it would have for a Beatle or a king. The obituary in the New York Times was respectful but brief, tucked away in the back pages. To the vast majority of the public, it was just the passing of another old man in California. But within the fraternity of musicians, the secret society of those who speak the language of strings and frets, the news hit with the force of a physical blow. A library had burned down. A frequency had gone silent. Merle Haggard, the man who had promised Roy they would make history, was devastated. He had lost his musical compass. He had lost the man who could finish his sentences before he spoke them. In the days following Roy's death, the reality of the loss settled in. The Strangers, the greatest backing band in the history of country music, were officially gone. The name might continue, the bus might keep rolling, but the soul of the machine had left the building. The funeral was not a spectacle. It was, fittingly, a gathering of the working class of the music industry, the session players, the roadies, the drivers, the people who actually built the sounds that the stars took credit for. They stood around the grave in the blistering heat of the San Joaquin Valley, the same heat that had baked the cotton fields of Roy's youth. They didn't talk about his fame, the very energy required to stand upright for 2 hours. As Roy's lungs slowly turned into useless, inelastic sacks, his body was being starved of the fuel it needed to perform the miracles he was famous for, yet he refused to stop. The denial was profound. Before shows, he found himself leaning harder on inhalers and long stretches of rest, trying to pack enough air into his lungs to get through the set. Then he would walk out, plug in, and play as if nothing were wrong. When the lights went down, the bill came due, he'd retreat to the darkness of the bus, gasping, his chest heaving, a man drowning on dry land. The 1990s brought a final cruel resurgence of interest. A new generation of hat acts, stars like Alan Jackson and Dwight Yoakam, began to cite the Bakersfield Sound as their Bible. They worshipped the crisp, trebly guitar tone that Roy had invented. Suddenly, Roy was being recognized as a forefather. Guitar magazines wanted interviews. Young players in Nashville were buying Telecasters and trying to learn the Nichols bend. It should have been a victory lap. But biology does not care about legacy. The end did not come with a final concert or a farewell tour. It came with the brutal suddenness of a snapped string. It was 1996. The Strangers were still on the road, grinding out the miles, but Roy had stepped off the bus nearly a decade earlier. At 64, living back in Bakersfield rather than in a bunk on the tour coach, he suffered the stroke that ended his playing for good. It wasn't a theatrical heart attack on stage. It was a quiet, devastating neurological event that severed the connection between the architect and his tools. The stroke targeted the left side of his body, the side that controlled his fretting hand. In a matter of moments, the hand that had danced across the strings with the grace of a spider was rendered motionless. The neural pathways that had memorized the geography of the fretboard were scrambled. For a musician, the loss of one's hands is a specific kind of death. It is an identity erasure. Roy Nichols wasn't just a man who played guitar, he was the guitar. His entire way of interacting with the world, of expressing emotion, of earning a living, of finding his place in the social hierarchy, was channeled through those 6 strings. Without them, he was just a sick old man in a hat. He was hospitalized, stabilized, and eventually sent home to Bakersfield. And then the hardest moment of his life occurred. The bus left without him. The Silver Eagle, the vessel that had been his home, his sanctuary, and his prison for 30 years, fired up its diesel engine. The rest of the band, his brothers in arms, had to leave. They had dates to play, contracts to fulfill. The show, as the cruel cliché dictates, must go on. Merle hired a replacement. The repertoire continued. The songs that Roy had helped build, Mama Tried, The Fugitive, were played by someone else, standing in his spot, using his licks, but without his soul. Roy Nichols sat in his home in Bakersfield and watched the world move on. The psychological devastation was compounded by the physical agony of his emphysema. He was now tethered to a permanent oxygen supply, a plastic tube running to his nose, a leash that restricted his world to the length of the hose. This is the phase of the story that is rarely told in music biographies. We like stories of glorious burnouts or triumphant comebacks. We do not like stories of slow, quiet suffocation. We do not like to think of the virtuoso sitting in a recliner, staring at a guitar case he can no longer open, listening to the radio play songs he recorded when he was young and strong. But in this enforced silence, a different kind of dignity emerged. Roy did not become bitter. He did not lash out at Merle or the industry. He accepted his fate with the same stoic calm he had shown in the honky-tonks of 1948. He became a sage-like figure in the Bakersfield community. Young guitarists, hearing that the legend was grounded, would make pilgrimages to his house. They would sit at his feet, literally and metaphorically. Roy couldn't play for them, but he could speak. Between breaths, battling the wheeze in his chest, he would explain the philosophy of the instrument. He would talk about tone. He would talk about phrasing. "Don't play everything you know," he would whisper. "Save something. Leave a hole for the singer." He was passing the torch, not with fire, but with embers. Merle Haggard, to his credit, didn't forget his old friend. He checked in. He paid respects, but there was a distance now, the unbridgeable gap between the active and the invalid. Merle was still out there, chasing the white line, living the life that Roy had lost. When they spoke, it was the conversation of 2 survivors of a shipwreck, one who had made it to the lifeboat and one who was still treading water. As the millennium approached, because he had little, they talked about his tone. They talked about that one night in Tulsa, or that one solo in Chicago. They talked about the integrity of his playing. Now, more than 2 decades after his death, we are left to wrestle with the meaning of Roy Nichols' life. His story forces us to confront the uncomfortable Sideman paradox that lies at the heart of our celebrity culture. We worship the face on the album cover, the voice at the microphone. We ascribe all the genius, all the emotion, and all the credit to the singer. But music is a collaborative architecture. Merle Haggard provided the blueprint and the foundation, but Roy Nichols built the house. He hung the windows. He carved the details. Without Roy, Merle's songs are still great poems, but they lack the sonic haunting that makes them immortal. Roy Nichols represents the great erasure of the analog craftsman. He belongs to a generation of Americans who define themselves by their trade, not their brand. He was a guitarist in the same way his father was a laborer. He showed up, He did the job to the best of his ability, and he didn't ask for applause. He didn't have a stylist. He didn't have a social media manager. He didn't have an image. He just had a Telecaster and a set of hands. In the modern era where everyone is fighting to be an influencer, to be seen, to be viral, Roy's silence is almost radical. He proves that it is possible to be essential without being famous. He proves that you can change the course of an art form without ever stepping into the spotlight. His legacy is not found in statues or museums. It is found in the DNA of the music itself. Every time a modern country star releases a song with a biting, twangy guitar solo, they are quoting Roy Nichols. Every time an indie rocker tries to get that vintage sound, they are chasing Roy Nichols. He wrote the vocabulary of the electric country guitar. He created the standard by which all others are measured. He is the ghost in the machine of American music, present in every barroom and every radio station, even if the listeners don't know his name. But perhaps the most profound lesson of his life is found in the tragedy of his end. The music industry consumed him. It took his youth, it took his hearing, and eventually, through the smoke-filled air of the honky-tonks, it took his breath. He gave his body to the sound. There is a sacrificial quality to his story. He was a martyr to the road, a casualty of the relentless drive to entertain. As we look back at the long, dusty arc of his journey, from the labor camps of the Depression to the White House and finally to the quiet room in Bakersfield, we see a silver thread running through it all. It is the sound of that silver Fender Telecaster. It is a sound that is sharp, clear, and unpretentious. It is a sound that doesn't say. If you want to find Roy Nichols today, don't look at the charts. Don't look at the award shows. Go find an old vinyl copy of Swinging Doors or The Fugitive. Drop the needle in the groove. Wait for Merle to finish the verse. Listen to the way the guitar steps out of the shadows. It doesn't scream. It speaks. It cries with a metallic tear. It bends the note until it breaks your heart and then snaps back to reality with a rhythmic thud. That is Roy Nichols. He is still there, trapped in the wax, playing the perfect solo, forever young, forever healthy, standing in the spotlight of our ears, waiting for someone to notice the man who made the music cry.